Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you found your way here to find out more about neurological reorganization and what we do here at Meaningful Movement. My name is Jessie Forston, and all of my work and life experiences have brought me here. I began my career as an educator, teaching first grade for 8 years. It was during this time in the classroom that brought me to yoga and movement as a way to find balance during stressful times. It was then that I started looking for ways to bring this calming movement to my 6 and 7-year-old students, and I became certified as a children's and adult yoga teacher. Also around this time, I also had my first son, Everett, who was born 6 weeks early due to a condition I had called HELP syndrome. He was in the hospital for 4 weeks, but was a happy, healthy baby. During the summers after Everett was born, I taught yoga to students attending the Smart Boost Up program at A Chance to Grow in Minneapolis. And there I attended a workshop with Betty Lamont to find out more about something they called NR with my friend who has a son on the autism spectrum. And while I was listening, I made some connections about difficulties my son was having in loud social settings and also with anxiety. And this really piqued my interest as I knew that there might be some underlying issues that could pop up due to his early trauma, which in our case was an early birth and a stay in the hospital. Needless to say, I was curious and wanted more, which brought me to be certified in Neurological Reorganization in 2014. So let's start with the big question. What is neurological reorganization? The quick and dirty is this. It's a process that's based on the principles of normal brain growth and development. It uses movement, reflex, and sensory experience to stimulate brain function. It's based on research that has long confirmed the correlation between brain development and function, and it's non-invasive and drug-free. Anyone can do it at any age. Now let's go back to birth and even before. We use an ontogeny of human neurologic functions called the developmental sequence as a tool to guide us through how the brain gains function. The developmental profile was first developed by Glenn Dolman and his teams at the Institute for Achievement of Human Potential in Pennsylvania in around 1962. We know that a large window of growth begins in utero and lasts until children are approximately 6 to 8 years old, and then additional growth occurs during adolescence. And all of this growth is cumulative, each level building on the one before. Now, if you think about it like a house, if the early levels, the precortical levels of the brain, are not fully built and the foundation is shaky, the upper levels, or the cortical levels, will also be shaky. No matter how you try to strengthen the second floor, if the basement isn't strong enough, the house won't hold up. In neurological reorganization, we look at all levels of the brain, but primarily focus on the precortical levels, which are pre-verbal and don't speak or think. They are strengthened and built through sensory and motor experience. There's a wonderful video from Harvard that gives a visual of what I was referring to. However, it won't play in this recording, so I've added a link in the email that was sent to you. I suggest watching it because it does give a really nice visual. There's plenty of research out there that proves that the brain has neuroplasticity and the ability to change throughout our lives at any age. Specific stimuli can target deficits and grow connections at any age. And with neurological reorganization, we use specific stimuli to grow and organize the brain, especially those lower levels of the brain. Now you may ask yourself, what affects brain function, and why are we seeing so many issues in children these days? Well, there are many reasons, and some are more obvious than others. There's injury, and neglect, trauma, and abuse. And there's also poor infant nutrition. 70% of the first year's nutrition goes straight to the brain. Then we have birth trauma and bonding breaks, which are some of the things that affected my family. Birth trauma can be as common as being born cesarean. C-section babies miss out on integrating many of the primitive reflexes that are meant to be used up during the birthing process. And with our stress-filled lives, some babies are getting too much cortisol, epinephrine, and adrenaline while in utero, and this can be toxic for the brain. And finally, we're seeing a huge increase in children who have an incomplete developmental sequence due to lack of movement. There are so many apparatuses that we put our babies in that restrict movement. That same movement is what's needed to build and organize their brains, and we're restricting that for our convenience when they are young, but then we're paying the consequences when they are older and school age. Now, looking at the chart that I had you print out, at birth, babies come into the world with their entire central nervous system in place. We have all of our parts ready and waiting, but just as we have legs that we can't walk on yet, we also have parts of the brain that are not available to us yet. The process that makes the brain more available is called myelination. Myelin is the white fatty substance that covers the nerves like insulation on a cord, enabling efficient transmission of electrical signals. This myelin will grow up and surround portions of the brain so that the electrical circuitry is able to fire easily. But how does that really work? Well, in order to perform any kind of task, we have to activate various portions of our brain. So let's use the example of giving a presentation such as this as an example. To give a good presentation, our brains coordinate a complex set of actions involving our motor function, visual and audio processing, verbal language skills, and more. At first, the presentation might feel stiff and awkward. We might forget some of our points or flub an important phrase, but as we practice, it gets smoother and feels more natural and comfortable. What our practice is actually doing is helping the brain optimize for this set of coordinated activities through the process called myelination. Now, looking at the developmental sequence chart, it lists the 6 vertical columns as areas of human function. The 3 on the left are sensory functions, visual, auditory, and tactile, and the 3 on the right are motor functions, mobility, language, and manual competence. It's also the input side, sensory, and the output side, motor. So when we're born, our brains are myelinated to the medulla level, the red level of the chart. And it's here that we begin our journey through the developmental sequence. We're going to focus on the precortical levels, or the bottom 3 levels of the chart. It's often common for a child to come in to see me with a working cortical brain, but have an incomplete lower brain development. Just like I discussed in building a strong foundation, these children might be using too much of their cortical brain to complete tasks that should be automatic and happen using the precortical levels of the brain. So we start at the lowest level, which we call the medulla and spinal cord level. This is approximately birth to 1 month of age. This level keeps us alive when we're first born, and if there's an injury to this level, we see things such as coma. In the visual column, we see a light reflex or a pupillary reflex in babies. When the light is turned on, the pupils respond by contracting. In the auditory column, this is the startle reflex. This is a reflex that is a response to a sudden loss of support when the infant feels as if it's falling. It involves 3 distinct components: an abduction or spreading out of the arms and arch of the back, followed by an adduction or curling of everything in again, and is usually accompanied by crying. In the tactile column, the baby at this developmental stage will have a Babinski reflex and rooting reflex. The Babinski reflex occurs after the sole of the foot has been firmly stroked, and the big toe then moves upward or toward the top surface of the foot. The other toes fan out. The rooting reflex occurs when the baby automatically turns the face toward the stimulus when the cheek or lip is touched and makes sucking or rooting motions with the mouth. The rooting reflex helps to ensure successful breastfeeding. It's important to note that reflexes are automatic movements that are a gift from the brain and trigger movement. And as that movement organizes, it starts to stimulate the brain, myelination. As the brain is stimulated, it begins to create patterns of organization. In the mobility column, we see movement of the arms and legs without bodily movement, complete movement of the extremities, but no real purposeful movement. In language, we see a birth cry, a cry that says, "Here I am, this is me." And finally, in the manual column, we see a grasp reflex in the baby. When you put your hand in the baby's hand, their fingers curl up around your finger. It's so sweet. The brain then starts to grow myelin up through the level called the pons. It's between approximately 1 and 5 months. This is the level of the brain that takes care of vital life-preserving activity, and it's here that we feel fear and anxiety. Deep core emotional feelings such as, I deserve to be in this world and the world is a safe place, stem from this level of development. This level can often be affected by trauma, bonding breaks, and stress, and is generally the level where post-traumatic stress disorder and reactive attachment can occur. This is also the level of fight, flight, and freeze. And we'll go into each column a little bit deeper. Starting with visual competence. At this level of the brain, the baby sees outlines and enjoys gazing into faces. This begins the activation of the mirror neurons that are so important in the bonding process. The baby stares into the mom's eyes, which releases oxytocin, the hormone that aids in bonding. And this early eye contact also starts to build empathy and compassion as babies read their caregivers' faces. It's also at this level of the brain that horizontal eye tracking begins with a baby watching the caregiver move about the room. And believe it or not, this is the beginning of reading. Children need smooth horizontal eye tracking to be able to read. Often a child who skips many of the little words such as the, a, is, and may have skips in their horizontal tracking. This is something you can look for tonight by having your child watch an object moving horizontally about a foot from their face. Watch their eyeballs to see if they move smoothly or jump around, skip forward and back, and also notice if they want to move their head when watching the object. Next is auditory competence. At this point in the PONS level, the baby is not crying at every sound, but only threatening sounds like a dog barking or alarms going off in the house. The adult hears the cry and thinks, oh, I have to go take care of the baby, and they go and help the baby. This builds trust in that the baby knows they can express their needs and someone will come to help them. They hear a loud sound, they cry, someone comes to help them. This repeats, and that's how trust is built. If these needs aren't met, a child may have anxiety, fear, high cortisol levels, be hypervigilant, feel as if they can't trust anyone to take care of them, and might constantly be in survival mode. When children are in constant survival mode or have high stress, there's a cascade of stress hormones that in high levels can be neurotoxins. Some children who have had trauma of being left to cry in an orphanage or neglect, or have been in war-torn situations, can have brain profiles that look like someone who has had an actual brain injury. Stress hormones can have a massive impact on the brain. Also on the sensory side of the PONS level is tactile competence. At this level of development, a baby feels extremes such as hot and cold, the hungry full switch, and pain. And we begin to feel them as discrete sensations, separate from one another. This is the level of deep pain. Pain is there to be our friend and is an indicator of how we take care of ourselves. We need these sensations to keep ourselves alive. Someone underdeveloped in this area might be a risk taker. This area helps us to know how to know if something is dangerous, and it gives us a healthy fear. If someone doesn't feel pain appropriately, they might be able to push a child aside on the playground and laugh when they cry. When someone doesn't understand or feel pain, they have a difficult time understanding someone else's pain. This makes it difficult to develop true empathy and compassion. Also, if someone is underdeveloped in this area and has difficulty feeling, you may notice that they harm themselves or often run into others on purpose. A good example of this that all of us can understand is when we get Novocaine at the dentist. The brain hates that the absence of feeling is there, and once you leave the office, you're pushing and rubbing and tapping the area until the sensation comes back. You're trying to wake it up. It doesn't feel good not to feel. In older children, this includes sensations of needing to go to the bathroom. They might be the child who you ask if they have to go and they say no. and then 5 minutes later they have to go so bad it's an emergency. They don't feel it that they have to go until it's an emergency. It can look willful, like they're doing it on purpose, but really it's an underdeveloped pons level. Moving to the motor side of the chart, which are the outputs, we have mobility. Here we see a baby that is crawling on the tummy. This seemingly simple act of tummy crawling has a global impact on the child. Observing someone's tummy crawl, for us, is like a window into the pons level of development. When an infant is tummy crawling, their eyes are watching their hands, and this further develops the horizontal eye tracking. Also, the entire front of the body is in contact with the floor, which stimulates the genital area, which then increases awareness to this area, which allows for toilet training to occur at the appropriate time. In addition, tummy crawling opens the body and releases the muscles that will pull them into an upright posture when they're ready to stand up. For example, bringing the arms away from the body. Structurally, tummy crawling develops the arch of the foot, brings the feet out so children are not pigeon-toed, stretches the heel cord from heel to knee so that they're not toe walkers, wears in the hip sockets, creates a cervical curve so we can stand straight, and creates a range of motion in the proximal joints, shoulders and hips. With tummy crawling, the shoulders and hips become articulate so that by the time a child is upright and walking, they have arms that swing from the shoulders and legs that swing from the hips. When you see kids that have kind of a snowman type walk, where their entire pelvis and shoulder girdle move when walking, you can generally guess that they haven't had enough tummy crawling. Tummy crawling also increases chest and lung capacity because we're breathing against our body weight. Oxygen is the brain's most powerful nutrient. And this is also the beginnings of fine motor skills. In tummy crawling, the hand supinates and pronates with each active reach and passive turn under. We like to say that tummy crawling is kind of like a double click on this level of the brain. Babies that crawl are reinforcing all the other activities and skills at this level of the brain. We know that children who have been deprived of this developmental function are not going to do as well at any of these pons level skills. Now I want to take a second to step away from the chart and reinforce the importance of the floor here. This is a very important stage of development, but what's happening in our culture is that babies are not being put on their tummies as often. One of the reasons is the Back to Sleep campaign to prevent SIDS, which I'm fully in agreement with. But there are 24 hours in a day, and we need to make sure to make time for the tummy. There's a remarkable documented transition in how all of our children behave in a study from 1950 and 2000. In 1950, they asked typically developing 3, 5, and 7-year-olds to simply stand still as long as they could. They then repeated the study in 2000. In the year 2000, the 3-year-olds could not do it at all. The 5-year-olds could barely do what the 3-year-olds could do in 1950, and the 7-year-olds could not do what the 5-year-olds could do. Why is this? Some say it has to do with our culture. In 1953, there was a change in the way toys were marketed, according to an article by Alex Spiegel. During the show, The Mickey Mouse Club, there aired an ad for the Thunderburp toy. And this was the start of toy companies targeting ads to certain programs. This started the transition of play from activity to toys. When play is an activity, you're engaged in all the wonderful integrative things that help our brains grow. When you limit play to toys, you limit your creativity and the functioning at all levels of the central nervous system. You're now not creating any castle with your Legos, but you're creating Hogwarts Castle or the Disney Castle. Many children today lack the capacity to do the things that students used to be able to do. Yet we're asking them to read in kindergarten instead of first grade. Our society is asking children to complete a higher level of skills with lower levels of integration. Then we throw labels of ADHD, ASD, ODD into the mix, and we have a lot of problems. Even typically developing children are challenged by this. Thus, we have to get our babies out of their containers, out of their bouncies, jumpy seats, bumbos, etc., and get them onto the floor. The time babies spend in these items are essentially what I call zero developmental time. And though babies need to be in car seats while traveling, and moms need to have a baby in the exerciser outside the shower curtain when they take a shower, it's so important that we make the time for the tummy throughout the day. Okay, off my soapbox. Next, we have language competence. And the Pons level baby perceives things as black and white. They have a vital cry in response to threats. And this circles back to the auditory column in the cycle of response, where the baby cries, the caregiver comes and attends to them, and the trust in the world is created. Then we have manual competence and hand function. This baby grasps onto a finger, but if pulling before the shoulders leave the table, they can let go, the vital release. When you put your finger into your baby's hand, their little fingers will grasp on really tight, but if you put a little pressure on them now, they'll open back up again. This opening of the hand is like an ultimate trust in the universe. I am here and I am open. Challenges in this area may look like the thumbs in the fists, showing a high level anxiety and stress. Here they're reverting to the fetal position in a very unnoticeable way. So during the organization of the Pons level, the baby keeps making decisions about if they feel safe in the world and if someone is there for them. They're learning they are separate from the world, but connected to it. Adults with challenges at this level might say, I feel really isolated, or no one is there for me, and they may feel very alone. Children who have challenges at this level may be risk takers, may have difficulty with reading, may have a funny snowman walk because their proximal joints don't have the range of motion that they should, or they may be the bully on the playground because they have no true understanding of deep pain. Sometimes they may not care about the feelings of others and have no empathy or compassion. And they may depend only on themselves for survival because they don't know how to reach out to others. These kids didn't learn that the world is safe because they weren't given the environment for the oxytocin to show them the world is safe. This is an area of the brain that truly can't be reached through talk therapy and play therapy. It can only be reached through movement, reflexes, and sensory experiences. Moving up on the chart to the yellow level, we have the midbrain. Here we're talking about the region above the pons and below the cortex. There is also a part of the brain called the midbrain, but we're talking about the entire region. This level is about filtering out all of the excess. It's responsible for balancing, regulating, and filtering. This part of the brain's job is to find what is important and attend to it, while shutting out what is not necessary to attend to. This is the ability to pay attention. For example, you may be tired, you may hear a fan or a buzzing sound, but you know to pay attention to the speaker giving the presentation. Babies prior to this level take everything in at the same importance level, which is probably why they go to sleep all the time in loud places. But at this stage, we build up our buffering, filtering, and screening tools. It's also this stage that is the social bridge between the survival brain and the intellectual brain or cortex. This level of the brain, when disorganized, might bring labels such as OCD, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. Starting in the visual competence column again, at this level of development, a baby starts to appreciate detail and they can tell one person from another. This is why stranger anxiety develops between around 7 and 8 months. They didn't really know they were strangers before. This is also when vertical tracking develops, which is key in reading and mathematics. Think about those vertical addition and subtraction problems. This stage is also the beginnings of convergence, or eyes that are working together at near point. This stage starts to pull the two eyes in to look at the same thing at the same time. Where the pons level was the opening of everything, the midbrain level starts to pull things back in. And note that the midbrain activities start to create convergence, but convergence is actually a function of the cortex. But eyes that don't converge can affect the way you see and view the world, and this can cause anxiety and fear, reading comprehension issues, depth perception concerns, and difficulty seeing details within the details. Let's talk about an example of not being able to see the details within the detail. Now, I have a picture here of the refrigerator, and we've all had the situation where we're looking for something in the refrigerator, such as maybe some ketchup. And we look and we look and we look and we just cannot see the ketchup. But then we step away and look back, and the whole time there it was right in front of us. Or maybe somebody else is like, the ketchup is right here. That's an instance of not seeing the detail within the details. Now, in neurological reorganization, we're talking about the source of the problem. We're not talking about where the problem appears, but where it originates. So, for example, what happens when we don't have visual convergence? Think about reading. Kids can sometimes tell us interesting things. I can read, but you know, it's really hard when the letters turn from gray to black and gray to black again. Or, it's just fine until I get to the end of the page and the letters start just wiggling off. Not all the tutoring in the world is going to help the child whose letters turn from gray to black or wiggle off the page. We have to deal with the issue at its source. Also, thinking of reading, have you ever read a line when you're very tired and then you go back and reread the same line again and think, wait a minute, that's the same line I just read? This happens very regularly to many kids who don't have the skill of vertical tracking, and they don't even know it. They can't define it because they don't know any other way. And here we're talking about visual motor skills. And these are the signals that the brain is sending to the muscles of the eyes. We're not talking visual acuity, which is the sharpness of vision measured by the ability to discern letters, or numbers at a given distance. So oftentimes we might bring our child to the eye doctor and they're not even testing the things that we're really looking for. Many times that's where visual acuity gets checked, but not always visual motor skills. Moving to the right, we have the auditory column at the midbrain level. Now, babies at this developmental stage are beginning to appreciate tone of voice. Like a parent might say, I'm going to sell you to the zoo in a sing-songy voice, and the baby's okay. But if the tone is harsh, even if it's not directed at the baby, they can become upset. At this developmental stage, they may also startle at big sounds, but then know it's okay. It's just the dog, it's just the vacuum, etc. This stage we're also developing attention and focus and are learning to filter and prioritize. Now, if this level is organized, you can prioritize. But if it's disorganized or not complete, then everything a person hears is as important as everything else. Think about this in terms of school. The teacher's voice, the fan, the paper rustling, all have equal weight. Also, for kids with an incomplete or disorganized midbrain, there may be sound sensitivities, and they can't filter out the excess, and they may start to make their own white noise with humming and other sounds, so that the distractions around them don't bother them. This is also where we learn to pick up on nonverbal social cues, and 93% of communication is nonverbal. The dance of communication involves tone of voice, facial expression, posture, gesture, how close to stand, when to interject into conversation, and all of that. Children who burst into conversation, they can't really hear where the break is, so they just take a risk and jump in. These kids can sometimes be the jokes of the playground. Other kids somehow know intuitively of their deficits. A bully might say in a mean tone, "Yeah, sure, you're my best friend." And the kid goes home and he says, "I have a new best friend." They don't get the whole thing that just went down. They don't understand it, and that they don't understand they were just being made fun of. These kids often don't get humor or innuendo. So can be very difficult for teachers because at least half of what they teach is through their tonality. A teacher will say, "Class, sit at your desk, take out your crayons, and look at me." And even if you didn't hear my words, you will know that I said to do 3 things because of how I used my voice. Now, the kid that can't hear the little bullet points in the conversation, he's heard, "Sit down," and is now looking around and thinking, "What is everyone else doing?" Hearing tonality is very important. Next, we have tactile competence. And here we're talking about proprioception, knowing where you are in space and how the 2 sides of your body match up and work together. This is where we gain the sense of my space and your space, or personal boundaries. The understanding of, this is my hand and it belongs to me, and it's still my hand when it's under the table, and it still belongs to me even though I can't see it. This is the part of our brain that helps us manage the sensation of our clothes, textures, things like the feel of soap in our hands or peanut butter on our mouth. We can manage all of this because the brain shuts out anything that feels excessive or challenging. It filters it. Now, at birth, babies cannot feel very well and may not respond consistently to pain, hot or cold. But soon in the pons level of the brain, they begin to respond to these things, these more intense sensations quickly and instantly. But here at this next stage, the midbrain level, it allows us to be able to respond to more subtle variances in sensation and appreciate them. So like the subtleties of cool and warm, the lighter touch, soft, warm, and fuzzy. This is the time when a baby might attach to a blankie or stuffed toy or lovey. And this is also the level where we gain a general sense of security and begin to feel literally and figuratively grounded. When this area is undeveloped, you might see a clumsy child, someone who's uncoordinated in space. You might have a child who has difficulty with tags, textures, clothes. Maybe the kid who only wants to wear the same exact thing every day, or only soft pants, or only elastic waistbands. Or on the flip side, it may be a child who doesn't even notice when their clothes are twisted and bunched and all over the place. This may also be the child who comes into a room, looks around and has to touch everything around them. Or in school, as the class walks down the hallway, they're running their hand along the wall, maybe knocking artwork down or touching everyone in line in front and behind them. This child doesn't know where they are in space. If you have an disorganized midbrain, they're not feeling that where they are in space. So they're touching everything around them just to feel that I know where that is, or I know where you are, which helps me know where I am. Now, Jean Ayres is someone who many call the mother of sensory integration, and she studied this work alongside my mentor, Betty Lamont. And Jane Ayres chose to focus only on the tactile competencies column, which brought about sensory integration. And neurological reorganization deals with that, but also the whole brain, dealing with all the other columns, sensory and motor as well. Now, the corpus callosum isn't on our chart, and we kind of anchor it here to this tactile competence box, but it's an important part of the developmental sequence, and we talk about it right here. The corpus callosum is the broad band of nerve fibers, or the bridge between the right and left hemispheres of the brain, and it allows both sides of the brain to talk to each other. The corpus callosum helps with impulse and control. The right side of the brain is the impulse or the go button, and the left side of the brain is the control or the stop button. Someone who has a weak corpus callosum may look like a very impulsive child, because if the brain doesn't have that right-left communication, one side of the brain might have known the rules, and the other side of the brain is saying, hey, that looks like fun. And because you're not getting that communication between both sides of the brain, you can get a tremendous amount of impulsivity. A child with a weak corpus callosum may also look like someone who doesn't have a lot of understanding of cause and effect, or no common sense. Or it's a kid who's learning and forgetting. These kids, they can go through a process of learning and forgetting, learning and forgetting. Like a teacher may come in and say, we're going to do our threes times tables today. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. Great. And then the next day, the teacher comes in and the students are like, what? We don't know what this is. What are you talking about? It's because they learned it and stored it on one side of the brain, and maybe the next day they're kind of functioning in the other side of the brain, and that corpus callosum isn't allowing information to pass between both sides of the brain efficiently. Sometimes these are kids who get the dyslexia diagnosis. So for kids with a weak corpus callosum, it can be really hard to tell the difference between a B and a D. And if you don't know which side is which, how are you going to know the difference? How do you know which way the S goes when at any given moment it may look different? These kids also might have a lack of concept of time, difficulty with sequencing, difficulty counting coins, money, and they might have difficulty with trust. These trust issues can come up due to knowing something one day but not the next. And this is due to the fact that you may have told them something when they were in their right brain, and then you asked for retrieval when they were functioning in their left brain. You may get the, you didn't tell me that. And truly, they are unable to remember because it's stored on the other side of the brain, and the bridge between the two is not a fast-flowing highway. Now, think about a child who has two hemispheres of their brain that don't connect. They have a high brain threshold. They're risk takers, and their eyes don't track, so they can't read. They're going to have a lot of issues. And if we can correct it from the bottom up, which is what neurological reorganization does, we can have a lot of improvement in their skills. Moving over to the motor side of the midbrain level, let's take a look at mobility. The Pons level was tummy crawling, and here we move to creeping, or crawling on hands and knees. This movement organizes the midbrain level. It's important for structure and forms the lumbar curve. It also brings the feet in so that the child does not have a duck walk. This is a goal-oriented movement, and when the child starts to get into everything. With hands and knees creeping, your knees start to line up with your hip sockets, and your elbows start to line up with your shoulders. Your balance mechanisms start to kick in, and you're forcing visual convergence. And not only are these physical skills kicking in, but everything as it relates to at this level of the central nervous system gets reinforced, integrated, and stabilized. What we know about children who have never been on the floor is that these functions may be extremely disorganized. This step often gets missed when a baby is in an exerciser or a walker. Next is language competency, and at this level, it's the creation of meaningful sounds. The baby is babbling and cooing, sentences and paragraphs, but there's no actual words. This level of the brain gives us the ability to make all the sounds that will later turn into words. These children have the tone of voice and can talk to you with great meaning and great seriousness, even if they don't have actual words yet. This is an ideal time for learning an additional language because the brain is pruning out more brain cells than it even will in the later years because it's trying to specialize. At birth, you can make sounds from any language for the first few months, and if one is presented with another language, the brain space will be reserved. If a baby is only hearing English, they will prune away all those other sounds so they can't make them and can't really hear them. If a baby at this stage is introduced to another language, they can both hear and recreate the sounds. Manual competence here is the prehensile grasp. The whole hand is used to pick something up, like a Cheerio. The baby here starts to feed themselves, and supination and pronation, the rotation around the wrist and lower arm, begins to form. In addition, these babies start to have cortical opposition with the pointer and their thumb. Now, if I could, I would add a whole nother box just to the right here and label it stress response or HPA axis, which is a complete set of direct influences and feedback interactions among three endocrine glands: the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. At this midbrain level, we gain the capacity to deal with stress, to gear up and to do things at a higher stress level and still function. It's true that a little bit of stress is good for you because it can kick in a lot of functions. However, a lot of our children start to decompensate when a little stress is present. For example, when we say, "Hurry, hurry, get a move on," the person can often kick into high gear. But for some children, as was in my household, this can bring about a total meltdown. It triggers the fight, flight, or freeze, and a total decompensation occurs. This can also show up in older kids as text anxiety, or in some kids as rages, and is an example of an incomplete midbrain level. Now, those with an incomplete or disorganized midbrain level may have goofy, silly, ADHD type behavior. They have reading difficulties that are different than the Pons level. They can be distractible. They could be labeled as oppositional defiant, but this may just be their corpus callosum not functioning well. They have impulse control issues, they're disorganized, they can be uncoordinated, they may have anxiety or OCD type behaviors, they may be sensory avoidant or just the opposite, want all the different sensory textures around them, or they may have trouble with learning and forgetting. All of this development takes place in about the first year of life, and it's the foundation that carries us through the rest of our lives. We learn these new skills at the precortical levels, and then they become more sophisticated in the cortex. In life and school, we're constantly working on our cortex, and the lower levels of the brain often get overlooked. This is what makes what we do at Meaningful Movement with neurological reorganization different. We look at the foundation, or the source, first, and then build up from there. Please feel free to contact us. For more information, you can visit our website at www.meaningfulmovement.org, or you can email me with questions about your specific child or needs at jessie@meaningfulmovement.org. I would also like to offer a free screening in our Minneapolis studio or via Skype to find out more and if Meaningful Movement would be a good fit for your child. Thanks so much for listening.